On February 19, 1945, American forces invaded Iwo Jima, a volcanic island measuring 8 miles long and 4 miles wide in the Pacific Ocean. The island was defended by approximately 22,000 Japanese soldiers, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Unlike previous Pacific battles where Japanese forces launched suicidal banzai charges, Kuribayashi implemented a new defensive strategy. Japanese forces would not contest the beaches. Instead, they would retreat into an extensive tunnel system carved into the island's volcanic rock and fight a war of attrition from fortified positions underground. The tunnel network on Iwo Jima was extraordinary. Engineers had excavated over 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting defensive positions, command bunkers, storage rooms, and living quarters. The tunnels were designed to allow Japanese forces to move undetected between positions, resupply defenders, and evacuate wounded without exposure to American fire. Ventilation shafts provided air. Multiple entrances and exits prevented entrapment. The tunnels were stocked with ammunition, weapons, and limited food supplies intended to sustain the garrison for weeks of combat. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, from February 19th to March 26, 1945. Japanese forces fought almost entirely from underground positions. American forces controlled the surface, but Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels to attack at night and then disappeared underground before dawn. Resupply was impossible. The island was surrounded by American naval forces. No supplies reached Iwo Jima after the invasion began. Japanese soldiers survived on pre-positioned stocks stored in the tunnels. By the battle's end, over 18,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Approximately 200 were captured. The remainder, estimated at 3,000, remained in the tunnels, some continuing to resist for weeks or months after the official end of combat. The soldiers who fought from the tunnels experienced conditions that tested the limits of human endurance: darkness, heat, thirst, hunger, and the knowledge that survival was unlikely. This analysis examines what Japanese soldiers ate during 36 days in the tunnels, how food supplies were managed, and what soldiers did when supplies ran out. General Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944 and immediately recognized that conventional defensive tactics would fail. The island had no natural cover, no forests, and limited vegetation. Beach defenses could be destroyed by naval bombardment. Kuribayashi ordered the construction of underground fortifications that would allow defenders to survive bombardment and fight from concealed positions. Engineers began excavating tunnels in the summer of 1944. The volcanic rock was soft enough to dig, but hard enough to resist collapse. Tunnels were carved using hand tools, explosives, and mining equipment. The network grew rapidly. By February 1945, the tunnel system included command centers, barracks, ammunition storage rooms, hospitals, and supply depots. Ventilation shafts and fresh water sources were located. The tunnels were designed to support sustained combat operations. Food supplies were stockpiled in designated storage chambers within the tunnel network. The Japanese military supplied the garrison with rice, canned goods, dried fish, pickled vegetables, soy sauce, miso paste, and hardtack biscuits. These supplies were transported to Iwo Jima by ship and submarine through late 1944 and early 1945. However, American submarine activity and air attacks disrupted supply shipments. Many vessels carrying food were sunk before reaching the island. The garrison received less food than planned. By February 1945, food stocks were insufficient for a prolonged siege. Kuribayashi's operational plan assumed the garrison would fight for 2 to 3 weeks before being overrun. Food supplies reflected this assumption. Rations were calculated to sustain 22,000 men for approximately 20 days of combat at reduced intake levels. Soldiers were instructed to ration food carefully and prioritize combat effectiveness over adequate nutrition. The stockpiled food was distributed across multiple storage locations within the tunnel network to prevent total loss if one section was destroyed or captured. Each defensive sector maintained its own supplies. This decentralization reduced vulnerability but created coordination problems. Once American forces controlled the surface, movement between tunnel sections became dangerous or impossible. Soldiers in isolated sections could not access supplies stored elsewhere. Japanese military rations in 1945 were based on rice as the staple food. A standard daily ration for a soldier consisted of approximately 600 grams of rice, supplemented by canned fish or meat, pickled vegetables, miso paste for soup, soy sauce, and tea. This provided approximately 2,000 to 2,200 calories per day, adequate for moderate activity but below requirements for sustained combat, which could exceed 3,000 calories daily. On Iwo Jima, rations were reduced before the invasion. Kuribayashi ordered daily rice rations cut to 400 grams per soldier to extend supply duration. Canned fish or meat was issued once every 2 to 3 days instead of daily. Pickled vegetables were limited to small portions. Miso paste for soup was rationed carefully, enough for one small bowl per day when available. Cooking facilities in the tunnels were limited. Open fires produced smoke that could reveal tunnel locations. Soldiers cooked using small charcoal burners or alcohol stoves in ventilated chambers deep within the tunnel system. Rice was cooked in metal pots with water from underground springs or stored supplies. The rice was often undercooked or burned due to inadequate heat control and limited fuel. Water was more critical than food. The island had limited fresh water sources. Wells had been dug, and some tunnels accessed underground water, but supply was insufficient for 22,000 men. Water was rationed strictly. Soldiers received approximately 1 liter per day for drinking and cooking. There was no water for washing or sanitation. Dehydration became severe as the battle progressed, particularly in tunnels where heat and poor ventilation increased perspiration. The caloric intake from reduced rations, approximately 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day, was insufficient for soldiers engaged in combat. Weight loss, fatigue, and reduced physical capacity were inevitable. Kuribayashi acknowledged this in orders to his troops, stating that soldiers must endure hardship and accept that survival was secondary to inflicting maximum casualties on American forces. The American invasion began on February 19th with naval bombardment and amphibious landings. Japanese forces in beach defenses engaged American troops but were quickly overwhelmed. Surviving defenders retreated into the tunnels as planned. By nightfall, most Japanese forces were underground. During the first week, food supplies were relatively adequate. Soldiers ate the standard reduced ration, 400 grams of rice per day, supplemented by canned fish or pickled vegetables every few days. Miso soup was prepared when fuel and water allowed. The food was monotonous and insufficient, but soldiers were not yet starving. The primary challenges were heat, darkness, and psychological stress. Cooking was conducted in shifts in designated chambers where ventilation allowed smoke to dissipate. Soldiers took turns preparing rice and soup. The process was slow. Fuel for cooking was limited, and water had to be transported from wells or storage tanks deeper in the tunnels. Some units cooked only once per day, preparing enough rice for the entire day and eating it cold for subsequent meals. Japanese doctrine emphasized discipline and endurance. Officers enforced strict rationing to ensure supplies lasted as long as possible. Soldiers who hoarded food or consumed more than their allotted portion were disciplined. The rationing system relied on unit cohesion and obedience to authority, which remained strong during the first week. Night raids provided some relief. Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels after dark to attack American positions and scavenge supplies. Some found abandoned American rations, C rations, and K rations, and brought them back. These American rations were valued for their caloric density. A single sea ration provided more calories than a day's worth of reduced Japanese rations. However, the quantity captured was small. By the end of the first week, American forces had advanced across much of the island. Japanese tunnel sections became isolated from each other. Soldiers in northern sections could not access supplies stored in southern sections. The decentralized supply system now meant that some units had adequate food while others faced shortages. By the second week of combat, food supplies in many tunnel sections were running low. The original calculations assumed 20 days of supply, but those calculations assumed centralized distribution. Isolated tunnel complexes could not share resources. Some sections had exhausted their rice stocks. Others had supplies, but no way to distribute them. Soldiers began eating smaller portions. The daily rice ration was reduced from 400 grams to 200 or 300 grams. Supplementary items, canned fish, pickled vegetables, miso paste, were reserved for the wounded or critically ill. Healthy soldiers received only rice and water. The reduced caloric intake caused rapid weight loss and fatigue. Soldiers performing physically demanding tasks, carrying ammunition, digging tunnels, engaging in combat, suffered most. Hunger became constant. Soldiers reported feeling weak, dizzy, and unable to concentrate. Physical performance degraded. Tasks requiring strength or endurance became difficult. Soldiers, moving through tunnels to attack American positions at night, experienced exhaustion after short distances. Combat effectiveness declined as malnutrition progressed. Some units attempted to supplement rations by scavenging. Soldiers searched abandoned sections of the tunnel network for overlooked supplies. Storage rooms in overrun or collapsed sections were accessed when possible. Small caches of rice or canned goods were found and distributed. These discoveries provided temporary relief, but were insufficient. Discipline remained strong, but tensions increased. Hunger affected morale. Soldiers who had fought for weeks without adequate food, water, or sleep questioned whether continued resistance served any purpose. Officers reminded soldiers of their duty and the expectation that they fight to the death. Surrender was not discussed. Japanese military culture emphasized honor and sacrifice. Starvation was accepted as preferable to capture. Water shortages compounded the food crisis. Wells in some tunnel sections ran dry or became contaminated. Soldiers in sections without water sources faced severe dehydration. Some attempted to collect condensation from tunnel walls or drank their own urine. Dehydration caused physical collapse and reduced the body's ability to process the limited food available. American forces continued advancing, destroying tunnel entrances with flamethrowers and explosives. Sections of the tunnel network were sealed, trapping soldiers inside without escape routes or resupply. By the third week, organized rationing had collapsed in many tunnel sections. Supplies were exhausted. Soldiers ate whatever could be found, items not intended for human consumption, and materials scavenged from the environment. Leather items were consumed. Soldiers boiled leather belts, boots, and straps to soften them, then chewed and swallowed the material. Leather provided no nutritional value, but filled stomachs temporarily. The process of chewing leather reduced psychological distress of hunger, even though it did not alleviate starvation. Tree roots and plant material were scavenged from tunnel entrances or areas where vegetation penetrated underground. Roots were boiled to remove bitterness and eaten. Some plants on Iwo Jima were toxic, and soldiers who consumed unknown vegetation experienced vomiting and diarrhea, further weakening them. Insects and small animals found in the tunnels were eaten. Rats, which infested some tunnel sections, were trapped and cooked. Rat meat provided protein and fat, making it valuable, despite the revulsion soldiers felt. Insects, beetles, grubs, and larvae were consumed raw or cooked. Soldiers who overcame cultural aversion to eating insects found them more nutritious than plant material. Salt water was sometimes consumed when fresh water was unavailable. Drinking salt water caused severe dehydration and kidney damage, but soldiers facing immediate thirst prioritized short-term relief. Some soldiers who drank salt water died from kidney failure within days. Cannibalism has been reported in some accounts, though documentation is limited and controversial. Some survivors and American forces who cleared tunnels reported finding evidence that Japanese soldiers consumed flesh of dead comrades. The practice, if it occurred, was driven by extreme starvation. Japanese military culture strongly prohibited cannibalism, and soldiers who engaged in it would have done so only under the most extreme conditions. Medical supplies included nutritional supplements, but these were reserved for the wounded. Soldiers in tunnel hospitals received small quantities of glucose solution or condensed milk when available. Healthy soldiers did not have access to medical nutrition. By the end of the third week, many soldiers were incapacitated by starvation. They could not move without assistance. Combat operations from these sections ceased. Soldiers lay in tunnels, waiting for death. The fourth week saw the collapse of organized Japanese resistance on the surface. American forces controlled most of the island. Japanese forces were confined to isolated tunnel sections, cut off from any possibility of resupply. Soldiers knew the battle was lost. Orders from General Kuribayashi emphasized continued resistance, but many soldiers were too weak to fight. Food was completely exhausted in most tunnel sections. Soldiers subsisted on water alone when water was available. Those without water died within days. Starvation progressed to its final stages. Soldiers experienced severe muscle wasting, organ failure, and mental deterioration. Many became delirious, unable to recognize comrades or understand their situation. Some soldiers chose to die in combat rather than starve. They emerged from tunnels armed with whatever weapons remained and charged American positions. These attacks were not coordinated charges, but individual or small group actions driven by desperation. American forces killed the attackers, sometimes recognizing that they were starving men seeking death. Other soldiers remained in the tunnels, waiting for the end. Japanese military tradition emphasized dying with honor. Soldiers who could no longer fight committed suicide using grenades, firearms, or bladed weapons. Officers led group suicides, ordering subordinates to detonate grenades in enclosed spaces. Some tunnel sections became mass graves where entire units died together. A small number of soldiers surrendered. By March 26th, when American forces declared the island secured, approximately 200 Japanese soldiers had been captured. Most were wounded, unconscious, or too weak to resist. Surrender was considered shameful. American forces clearing tunnels after the battle found scenes of horror. Tunnels contained bodies of soldiers who had starved to death, often in groups. Evidence of final meals, rat bones, leather scraps, plant material, was found near bodies. Some soldiers had written final messages to families, describing their suffering and expressing loyalty to the emperor. The battle officially ended on March 26th, but isolated Japanese soldiers continued to emerge from tunnels for months. The last confirmed Japanese holdout on Iwo Jima surrendered in 1949, 4 years after the battle. Starvation in the Iwo Jima tunnels progressed through recognizable physiological stages. In the first week of reduced rations, soldiers experienced hunger, irritability, and reduced energy. The body began metabolizing fat stores to compensate for caloric deficit. Weight loss was noticeable but not yet debilitating. By the second week, fat stores were depleted, and the body began breaking down muscle tissue for energy. Soldiers lost strength and endurance. Physical tasks became difficult. The immune system weakened, making soldiers susceptible to infections. Wounds healed slowly or not at all. Mental function declined. Soldiers had difficulty concentrating, making decisions, or remembering instructions. Vision became blurred. Coordination deteriorated. In the third and fourth weeks, starvation reached critical stages. Muscle wasting was severe. Soldiers could not walk without assistance. Skin became loose and discolored. Organ function deteriorated. The heart weakened, causing arrhythmias and reduced cardiac output. Blood pressure dropped. The liver and kidneys failed to process waste products, leading to toxin buildup in the blood. Edema developed in extremities as protein levels fell. Soldiers experienced confusion, hallucinations, and loss of consciousness. Psychological effects were profound. Hunger dominated thoughts. Soldiers obsessed over food, discussing meals they had eaten before the war or describing imaginary feasts. Some experienced vivid dreams of eating. The psychological distress of starvation was as debilitating as the physical effects. Soldiers lost the will to resist, becoming passive and resigned to death. Social bonds broke down under extreme deprivation. Soldiers who had been comrades became competitors for scarce resources. Reports from survivors described conflicts over water or scraps of food. In some cases, stronger soldiers took food from weaker ones. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as unit cohesion eroded. The combination of starvation, dehydration, heat, darkness, and combat stress created conditions that few humans could endure for extended periods. The soldiers who survived did so through extraordinary physical resilience, psychological fortitude, or luck. Most did not survive. The battle for Iwo Jima cost 6,821 American lives and wounded 19,217. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Over 18,000 killed, fewer than 200 captured. The Japanese garrison fought almost to the last man, inflicting casualties on American forces at a ratio unprecedented in the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated the extreme cost of assaulting fortified positions, defended by soldiers committed to fighting to the death. The experience of Japanese soldiers in the Iwo Jima tunnels provides insight into the limits of human endurance. Soldiers endured 36 days of combat with inadequate food, limited water, extreme heat, darkness, and the certainty of death. Most chose to fight until killed or to commit suicide rather than surrender. The cultural and military factors that produced this behavior, emphasis on honor, shame associated with surrender, loyalty to the emperor, were unique to the Japanese military in World War II. The battle influenced American strategic planning. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima reinforced concerns about the cost of invading the Japanese home islands. Estimates projected hundreds of thousands of American casualties if Japan had to be conquered island by island. These projections contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. For Japanese survivors, the experience carried lifelong trauma. Soldiers who surrendered faced shame and struggled to reintegrate into post-war Japanese society. Many suffered from malnutrition-related health problems for the rest of their lives. Psychological trauma affected survivors, though mental health treatment was not culturally accepted. The tunnels of Iwo Jima remain largely intact. Some have been explored by historians and archaeologists. Artifacts found in the tunnels, cooking pots, empty food containers, personal effects, provide physical evidence of what soldiers endured. The tunnels are a monument to suffering and sacrifice. The question of what Japanese soldiers ate for 36 days in the tunnels has a simple answer: less and less, until nothing remained. The story is not about food, but about what humans endure when survival is impossible and death is certain. Their suffering was immense, their sacrifice absolute, and their experience a reminder of the human cost of war.